Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Lunch and Learn. Don't be so sure the psychological and social benefits of intellectual humility. My name is Simone Figueroa, and I am the president of Youth Thrive Educational Services. And before we jump in, I wanted to take a moment to quickly introduce our organization for those of you who we've not had the opportunity of partnering with. Youth Thrive Educational Services provides proactive mental and emotional wellness solutions to college students to help them manage stress, become more resilient, and thrive. And today we are so excited to welcome Youth Thrive Educational Services key contributor, Dr. Mark Leary. And I'm going to share a little bit about our esteemed guest before I turn it over to Mark. So Dr. Mark Leary is the Goranczyk Family Emeritus Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University and taught previously at Denison University, the University of Texas at Austin, and Wake Forest University, where he served as department chair. He has published 14 books and more than 250 scholarly articles and chapters on topics dealing with social motivation, emotion, and self-relevant thought. Leary is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. He received the Lifetime Career Award from the International Society for Self and Identity, the Distinguished Scientist Award from the Society for Experimental Social Psychology, and was co-recipient of the Scientific Impact Award from the Society for Experimental Social Psychology. He was founding editor of the journal Self and Identity, editor of Personality and Social Psychology Review, and in 2015 served as president of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. So before we begin, I invite you to please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself and throughout the presentation to put any questions that you might have, as we will definitely be leaving a few minutes at the end to answer any questions. And with that, Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for that gracious introduction. And hello, everybody. Let me share my screen with you. All right. Is that working there, Simone?
Looks great.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. To get started today, I'd like for us to do just a little mental exercise, if you will. I want you to think about all of the disagreements that you have with other people. We have lots of disagreements throughout our days, from minor disagreements about relatively unimportant things that we squabble about to major disagreements about things that are really important. If you think about all of the disagreements you've had in the last month or so, in what percentage of those disagreements that you've had with other people do you think that you were the one who was correct? Now, we don't always know. Sometimes we do know. We have a disagreement with somebody Googles and gets the right answer, and then you go, oh, that's right, I was wrong about that. A lot of times we don't know. We agree to disagree. We just let things hang. We don't discuss certain issues. We make decisions with someone else and we disagree about which way to go, but we make a decision. Who knows whether that was the right thing? Because if you'd have done it my way, it might have been better. It might have been worse. We don't know for sure, but just take a guess. What percentage of the time are you the one who's correct? Now, we often don't know, but if we did know for certain, and I asked a whole lot of people, what percentage of the time are you correct? The average ought to be about 50%, right? Because if somebody's right and somebody's wrong, on average, across all the people in the world, the average ought to be 50%. Now, some of us are right more than others. If you're more educated, more experienced, you have more ideas, you ought to be right more than somebody who's younger or inexperienced or less well educated. But on average, people ought to come out saying they're right about 50% of the time. Well, that's not what happens. When we did a survey of 300 American adults and asked them the same question I just asked you, what percentage of the time are you right? Here's what the data looked like. And don't get into the details of it. I just want you to focus on the fact that the 50% line is that red line on the far left. Only 4% of our participants said that they were right less than 50% of the time. And that can't be right. In fact, about 82% said that they were correct more than 50% of the time. And the average person said they were right about 70% of the time. Well, where is everybody? Where are all of the people who, in fact, are wrong less than half the time, uh, but apparently think that they're right? Well, that's most of us. That's me. That's all of these other people in this study. It's probably you. We think we're right more than we really are. Well, what's going on here? Well, a couple of things. One is that human nature includes an overconfidence bias. There's tons of studies that show that people's confidence in their knowledge and in their judgments is consistently greater than their objective accuracy. They ask people factual questions, get their answers, and ask them, what's the probability you're right about this answer, or this answer, and that answer? People consistently overestimate how much they're right. On top of that, there's the better than average effect. Most people believe that they're better than average on most positive characteristics, including their intelligence and knowledge. If you ask people, are you less intelligent than average or more intelligent than average? Vast majority say, well, I'm more intelligent than average. We also think that we're better drivers than average. Employees in an organization, you say, are you better or worse than the average employee in this organization? The vast majority say, I'm better than average. People believe they're better than average sexual partners. This is a really widespread effect. But we also think we're better than average in our beliefs, in our understanding of things. And these biases create a number of potential implications for the quality of our lives. They undermine the quality of our lives in a number of ways. First, they lead to bad decisions because we confidently make decisions that we're sometimes wrong about. And we kind of know that, but we overestimate how often we're right. These biases lead us to dismiss accurate information that's contrary to our opinions and beliefs. When you hear something that's against what you already think, well, it's wrong, clearly, because it's not what I believe. Well, that means that we dismiss things that are actually right. It also leads us to fail to correct our incorrect beliefs because we don't stop to think about whether or not we're right or not as often as we should. It leads to unnecessary arguments and conflicts because if everybody thinks they're right about 70% of the time, you and I are arguing about things that we shouldn't be arguing about. If we knew that one of us was right and one of us was wrong, the argument and conflict would go away. And it leads to an unwillingness to negotiate or compromise. Why should I negotiate or compromise with you if I'm right and you're wrong? Now, we do negotiate and compromise for practical reasons, but we do it begrudgingly because we know that we're in the right and that the other person's wrong, but yes, we've got to compromise. So these things undermine the quality of our lives in terms of our knowledge and our beliefs and our decisions. What's the solution? It's this thing called intellectual humility, which has become a very hot topic in psychological research the past 10 years or so. Intellectual humility is simply recognizing that your personal beliefs, attitudes, and viewpoints are fallible. They're potentially wrong. It's realizing that whatever you believe might, in fact, be wrong. Now, sometimes all of us consider the possibility we might be wrong, but people differ in how often they consciously stop and think, well, here's what I think, but I could be wrong about that. So you can sort of ask yourself, to what extent do you question your beliefs and opinions and viewpoints because you could be wrong? How often do you stop during the day when you have a thought, particularly if somebody disagrees with it, and really give it an honest appraisal and think, well, here's what I firmly believe, but could I be wrong about this? To what extent do you reconsider your beliefs and opinions when you're given new evidence? Some people do this a lot. If you show me something that suggests I might be wrong, I go, whoa, okay, let me think about this. I don't change my opinion immediately, but I at least consider it. Other people, they get new evidence and I go, no, that's not right. That's not what I think. And I don't really give it a fair chance. To what extent do you enjoy finding out new information that differs from what you already think is true? Most of us find this somewhat threatening when we learn something that might challenge some deeply held belief. Other people think, hey, that's cool. Let me stop and think about this and see where the truth really lies. And to what extent do you recognize the value of viewpoints that are different from yours? That's a mark of intellectual humility to realize, well, although I think I'm right about this thing that I believe, maybe you have something else to contribute. There's some value in your thoughts that I need to take into account. So intellectually humble people do these things more than less intellectually humble do. And now there's lots of research showing that there are a number of benefits of being more intellectually humble. Our own research several years ago, we did some studies that showed that people higher in intellectual humility, who stop and ask themselves, could I be wrong about this? They evaluate the quality of arguments and evidence more carefully, so they make better decisions. They spend more time really judging. What are the facts about this? What does the evidence really say? People higher in intellectual humility are less defensive when other people disagree with them. Now, let me make it clear: people who are high in intellectual humility firmly believe their beliefs. Yes, I believe this to be true. But because that little voice says, yeah, but maybe you're wrong about this, they are more accepting of people who disagree with them. They take them more seriously and they don't derogate them when they disagree with them. People lower in intellectual humility really smear people who disagree with them. They just don't say you're wrong, I disagree with you, but they say, well, no, I disagree with you. You're wrong and you're stupid and you're not a very nice person and you're not friendly and you're unethical. The negative judgments of people who disagree spread beyond disagreeing, just simply disagreeing with what you believe. And another benefit of intellectual humility, we're just now submitting a manuscript for publication where we looked at people in established relationships, people in relationships from 6 months to 27 years. We measured their intellectual humility and their satisfaction with their relationship, what their partner thought about the relationship, how much they argued. And people higher in intellectual humility had more satisfying romantic relationships. Why? Because they aren't a know it all. It's hard to live with somebody who thinks that they're always right. And if you at least consider the possibility you might be wrong, you and your partner are going to be more satisfied in a relationship. There's also some new research on the benefits of intellectual humility at work. It suggests that employees and managers who are more open to other people's suggestions and more open to the possibility that their ideas might be wrong come to better decisions and better organizational outcomes. And there's also research looking at intellectual humility in leadership that shows that the subordinates of leaders who are higher in intellectual humility have higher morale and job satisfaction. They feel more engaged in their jobs when they're working for somebody who's higher in intellectual humility. We all know what it feels like to make suggestions to our boss, maybe even suggest the boss's idea isn't quite right and to be dismissed immediately. But to have a boss who takes that seriously doesn't mean the boss agrees or changes their mind every time, not at all. But to know that somebody really listens to your suggestions makes you a more motivated employee. So I could go on and on, but there's plenty of research showing that there are many benefits for the quality of life of just being aware of the fact that you might be wrong about whatever the issue is at hand. Now, some people have suggested there are also some downsides that I want to acknowledge. There's not really any research on this, but I want to acknowledge maybe intellectual humility does have some downsides. People have suggested it probably leads to slower decisions. And that's probably right. We don't have any evidence of that. But yeah, if you're low in intellectual humility and whatever you think is completely right all the time, as soon as you make the decision, you go on with the course of action and you don't waffle over it. A highly intellectually humble person makes a decision, they think they have the thing figured out, but then they go, but is it possible I could be wrong about this? So they explore it a little bit more. They're not paralyzed, they will take action, but they probably do think about it more. Some people have suggested to me that intellectually humble people might be reluctant to take a stand because they're not sure that they're right, that their position is right. So imagine you're favoring some kind of a social justice issue. Something bad's happening and we need to take a stand. We need to protest and fix this situation. It's been suggested an intellectually humble person might have second thoughts and say, yeah, maybe, but maybe I'm wrong about my interpretation of what's going on here. There's no evidence of that. Intellectually humble people believe what they believe firmly. They do take action. They just have this little voice on their shoulder saying, okay, do this, but keep your eyes open for the possibility you might be wrong. And I've had people say they don't want to be intellectually humble because it makes them appear uncertain and wishy-washy. But there's nothing in intellectual humility that says that you have to wear it on your sleeve. There's nothing in intellectual humility that says that you have to preface everything you say with the phrase, hey, I could be wrong about this, but whatever. Intellectual humility is a cognitive thing. It's just recognizing that whatever you believe could potentially be wrong. So if you say, well, hey, yeah, this sounds like a good idea. None of us are as intellectually humble as we probably should be, the data suggest. What can we do to increase intellectual humility? And let me just give you a few things that have not been supported by research. There's not much research on how we increase it. There's some, but just some things that come out of the literature. First, the number one thing is just to remain vigilant for this overconfidence bias that I mentioned at the beginning. Obviously, not everything you believe is true. I think we can all agree with that. In fact, I'm intellectually arrogant about that statement. I am convinced 100% not everything I believe is true. And if that's the case, I need to remind myself of that now and then. We all know that, but we need to remind ourselves. And for centuries, philosophers have told us that knowing you might be wrong is a sign of intellectual maturity. It's not lack of confidence or wishy-washiness. An intellectually mature person knows that they might be wrong. How do you do that? One way that's been suggested is that in a particular situation, to ask yourself, in what ways might I be wrong about this issue? You see, what most of us do when we're trying to find evidence for our beliefs, we look for supporting evidence, and we can also often find some. Where's the evidence that I'm right about this? You're more likely to detect problems in your beliefs if you search for disconfirming evidence. In what ways might I be wrong about this issue? And it's been suggested that one way to do that in a particular situation is to ask yourself, do I really have all of the relevant information I need for this belief or decision? And am I 100% certain that all of the information is accurate and unbiased? And when I've tried this out on myself, I'm never certain I have all the relevant information. And I'm never 100% certain that it's accurate and unbiased information, at least very rarely. So that automatically kicks you into this intellectually humble mindset at that moment to go, oh, dang, I shouldn't be quite as sure about this as I probably am. Second tip, stop thinking of correctness as a right versus wrong dichotomy. Generally, when we disagree with somebody, you're wrong and I'm right. It's a zero-sum thing. You're completely wrong and I'm completely right. Beliefs don't usually work that way. So I recommend that instead you should ask yourself, what's the probability that I am totally correct? And what's the probability the other person is totally wrong? And rarely when I do that, do I say, I am sure I'm 100% right and that other person is a complete idiot and there's 0% chance that they're correct. So I say, well, I'll give myself 85%. I'm not completely certain, but I'll say I'm 85% likely to be right. And yeah, they're not a complete idiot. I'll give them 35% right. Now we're closer together. We're not at opposite ends of the continuum. We can have a more intelligent conversation about our disagreement if we can recognize that the other person might have something to say. And this requires thinking of beliefs and knowledge as a continuum rather than just right or wrong. Most of the examples I've given have dealt with fact-based beliefs, where we disagree about a fact, where we can find evidence. A lot of times we disagree about opinions. Um, and I think this is an important distinction because when I catch myself now realizing we're arguing about an opinion, then it just becomes a preference. It's not a right or wrong decision. Example that comes up in my life, and no matter what kind of music you like, there's probably genres of music where you sort of think, What the heck? Who can listen to that? That's not even music. That's terrible. Even though there's millions of people loving that genre of music. Well, that's not a factual thing. That's a preference. And it's okay to say, well, I prefer this music rather than that music, or I like this food rather than that food. But it's not the kind of thing where somebody is right and somebody is wrong. The other thing I would suggest is when we get into these conundrums where we're trying to figure out what's right and we're in an argument with somebody, to look at your motives. What I've what I've realized is that there's three things going on in my mind when I'm in one of these disagreements. To some extent, I want to think that I'm right. We feel better. We like to be certain. We want to feel good about ourselves for having the right view of something. So we want to think we're right. At the same time, we want to look like we're right to other people. That's okay. And I assume we also actually want to be right. And I've found as I've started to apply this that when I'm in an argument, I'm doing all of these things at once. I want to think I'm right. I want to look like I'm right. And I want to actually be right. But when I think consciously about these three things, it makes me emphasize the importance of being right and to be less concerned about just wanting to think I'm right or just wanting to look like I'm right. One last thing. Sometimes we're absolutely convinced we're right, and that's okay. I mean, sometimes we have the evidence and we're completely committed to something, and there's no intellectual humility, and that's perfectly all right. We believe what we believe, but we still get in an argument. And I'll just mention one other piece of advice. When we're certain we're right, before arguing, ask yourself, does this really matter? Now, if it does, fine. It's open to debate. An argument may be needed. There's nothing wrong with arguing about important things. I've found, though, that an awful lot of times when I'm arguing with other people, I'm certain I'm right, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the least who's right and who's wrong in this situation. I'm just hurting people's feelings and getting angry, and my blood pressure is going up. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this doesn't make you more intellectually humble. This just makes you handle disagreements more agreeably. So there, I've thrown an awful lot at you. I've done it very, very quickly. So I'm just going to stop there and hear your thoughts and your questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. In a few moments, we will answer your questions. In the meantime, as we're waiting for
Oh,
questions to come in, do you hear me okay?
yes, I did because I had my sound hadn't been coming through. My speaker turned off. I'm
Oh,
okay. I'm okay now.
okay.
I'm okay now.
All right, great. So in the meantime, I'm going to share my screen. I just want to invite everybody, if you are interested in learning more about our offerings. We will be hosting a learning lab next month in January. You could scan the QR code, or I will also be putting a link in the chat for you to register. Um, and with that, I do see that a question has come through. Um, Emily says, or maybe it's just a statement. Emily says, I think reframing confrontational discussions about opinions as preferences rather than right versus wrong is a wonderful way to circumvent disagreements, especially in the workplace or with students. Great way to be open-minded. Yes.
Yes, and for me, just personally in my own life, that was a relatively recent revelation. Somebody else mentioned it. I didn't come up with that, but I had never thought of that before. I'd never really made the distinction between fact-based and opinion or preference-based beliefs. So yeah, I found it very useful.
And Olivia commented, imagine how much better the world would get along if we all practice this.
Yes, we could reduce so much of the conflict we have with other people. Not all of it. There's nothing wrong with disagreements and conflicts. Some people think that when you talk about intellectual humility, you're saying, oh, you should always give in to what other people think, or you should never argue with people. No, there's good reasons to disagree with people about important issues. But there's a better, agreeable way to approach those arguments if you continue to remind yourself you might be wrong.
Yeah, I completely agree. I really loved your closing point about asking ourselves if this really matters. That's something that I think that pause, that is such an important one for everybody to take, and that I didn't really think about that. And I think I'm going to try to implement that for sure in my life as well.
I
So
think of all of the fights that have broken out among drunk people in bars as they're just arguing about who was the best NFL team ever or something like that. But it doesn't matter.
Julie says we are in dangerous territory when we are willing to defend our preferences, opinions to the death. And I mean to the death of no personal growth, loss of friendships, family members, destroyed relationships, etc.
Absolutely. And again, everybody has a red line that they draw. There are times in which no reasonable person would go ahead and agree with other people or even live with the disagreement from another person. That intellectual humility would seem really out of whack. But we all go too far in defending our views, making a big deal out of things that don't matter. Um, the problem is, where do you draw that red line? If I told you, I think cold-blooded murder is wrong, but I could be wrong about that. You'd say, well, what the heck is wrong? What the heck is wrong with you? There's certain things that we have to believe and draw a red line. I think the problems in society is that sometimes we all draw the red lines too leniently somehow. I mean, they're too, we draw them too easily and act like some of these disagreements are completely abhorrent when they're just kind of annoying and we don't like them very much. So yes, society would improve if everybody could do this a little more.
Olivia has asked, are you the author of The Curse of Self that I'm seeing on Amazon? I'd like to delve more into this.
Yes, yes, it's 20 years old now, but yeah, The Curse of the Self, which has to do with all of the problems we create for ourselves by the way we think about ourselves in our own minds. And I wasn't doing intellectual humility research at the time, but this would be an outgrowth of that. These are thoughts I have about myself and how much I know about stuff that are undermining my quality of life. So yes, it's called The Curse of the Self.
That's great. Um, yeah, another comment that came through is what I always say, just because someone says something confidently doesn't make it true. The sooner we embrace that truth, the sooner we can walk away in peace.
Yes. Yeah. And wouldn't it be nice if we could all agree on the truth just more easily? I don't know how we do that. I mean, that's because again, I guess it has to do with, people relying more on evidence, basing their beliefs more on evidence than just gut feelings or what somebody happened to tell them would help a lot because then we would converge on the evidence. We'd still disagree. Even scientists disagree about what the evidence says sometimes, but we would agree a lot more if our thinking was more evidence-based.
Oh, okay. So with that, Mark and I will stick around for another 2 or so minutes. We'll turn off our cameras, but if anybody has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And if not, thank you so much for joining us today and wishing everybody a wonderful holiday season, and a happy new year. So we will stick around for another 2 minutes or so. Um, and if not, hope to see you at our next event in January. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.